Good day, my Telos podcast friends. Today we're bringing to you 8 of the biggest problems with the EOSIO software and some of the solutions that are creative that Telos is coming up with. This is a interesting, wide-ranging conversation, and you are sure to learn a lot. I loved it. Jack Tanner from At the Blockstock. What a great mind. He comes chain agnostic, tons of deep dives and research into all the different blockchains out there, has put a lot of focus into Telos because of what's going on. So you will get some wide-ranging insight from the greater crypto community here, and some real deep insight into Telos and some of the problems and solutions that are right on the cutting edge right now. So this is a rad podcast. And this podcast is sponsored by Hybrid.Games. Check it out. Get on the mailing waiting list. And that is our sound engineer Scott's project that is coming along, and it's cool. So without further ado, let's get straight into the podcast. Welcome, Jack Tanner.
You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain.
The Telos Podcast.
You stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
All right. Well, welcome to the show, Jack. And what's the most interesting thing going on in Telos for you right now?
So I'm getting more and more involved in Telos. I've done 2 worker proposals now. I've got my second one live at the moment, and I mean, I started following the EOS project and the EOSIO software early on during the token sale, and I started when EOS launched. I was closely watching it. I was very impressed by its performance, and also its usability, and also its ease for development. But then I started seeing Telos and seeing what they were trying to do, and they were preempting some of the problems that EOS now has. And so I'm very excited at a technical level that the EOSIO software is a platform, is a kind of framework for governed blockchains, and that Telos has taken quite a few steps and is actively trying to be a better governed blockchain, the best governed blockchain out there. So I'm very interested in it at a technical level, both how they're using the EOSIO software framework to do what they're trying to do, and also at a more political level, what steps they've made to create this governed platform, this governed blockchain, and then what that implies for the DApps on it. And then I guess lastly, very exciting, is that I've done 2 worker proposals. So part of Telos, one of the things they've implemented is the worker proposal system, and that allows people like me who wants to contribute something to the community or to the development of the platform or the ecosystem. And it allows me to get something funded through the blockchain governance. It doesn't go through a company. It just gets voted on by other Telos members in a way that, in theory, will allow people actually adding value to get money to add that value. And I think it's worked reasonably well so far for me, and I've been having a look at some of the other proposals, and some of them don't get through and some of them do, and it's interesting to see what they do. How that's working, and that process has been updated as well while I've been working with it. So interesting to see what kind of things that system can do, but also just Telos as a whole. So I think it's just a very interesting technical and political project.
Yeah, it touches so many, it touches, like you're saying, technical, political. The worker proposal system has been a really interesting to see how it's flourished on Telos, and how many things have gotten built, and how many projects, and how many people have come over to help out. What is your worker proposal that you did in the past and that you're currently having voted on?
So I did one previous, and I'm doing basically a copy of the same one.
Okay.
So I'm organizing EOSIO workshops, and I teach developers how EOSIO framework works, to deploy networks like EOS and Telos, and how to develop on it. So I did the first one in London. It was a lot of lead work. I was teaching computer scientists, so I made sure that I understood basically everything that was going on, all the consensus stuff. I think at a high level, consensus can be summarized pretty quickly, but there's so many details, and a lot of them are quite important, especially once you're developing DApps on it.
Oh, yeah.
So there was a lot of work getting that done, and now we're doing the second two. We're doing one in Utrecht, which is near where I live in Amsterdam, and another one in London. And then I'm about to release a new worker proposal, which will be to basically do all the required background research and get everything right about Telos in a new upcoming video series called it'll be called Learn EOSIO. It'll be a free series on YouTube. It'll be teaching basically exactly how EOSIO framework works and basically looking at deployed networks like Telos in detail. And so there's a lot of value there. It'll be aimed at technical people. So I think a lot of investors should be able to get along with a lot of it, but there'll be a whole segment just for developers. So there'll be a free developer course built into it.
That's fantastic. That's part of the area that's so needed, is this bit of bridging the gap between developers and EOSIO software and how they can actually get in. It fits in with something that we're Justin at Infinity Block and then Telos San Francisco. We're talking about doing a conference called The Future of Work. And the future of work, kind of why the Silicon Valley is dead, but remote work isn't, or why tech work isn't. It's this idea that work's changing with things like the worker proposal, where a dev can go in and educate themselves on something like you're building with the YouTube videos, and then come in and look for a worker proposal that fits their skill set, or even find something to suggest that they can build and just get paid. It's really taking out, it changes the way that people look at work. When all of a sudden you can come in and add value and get paid for that value. You don't need, a company putting out jobs on a job board and then searching for them and going to work, in San Jose or something. You can be wherever you want around the world, applying your skill set directly. It's cool.
Yeah, and I think arguably a lot of really good examples of this happening in the Ethereum ecosystem as well. Mm-hmm. They have all of these bounty programs, and they've really flourished as well in that ecosystem. So it's definitely not EOS specific, and it's an interesting shift in how workforces can be kind of utilized. I'm not sure it applies everywhere, but it applies quite well to technical work like developing.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would be the main difference between like the EOSIO or Telos worker proposal specifically and like a ETH bounty system? What would be the biggest differences?
So I think the Ethereum bounty systems, a lot of them are companies put up, we have this problem and this is the prize for solving it. Mm-hmm. This is what I've seen quite common. And then a dev can come along, solve it, create a PR, and basically if it solves it, they get paid. Okay. Whereas the worker proposal system is the other way around. The person making the proposal says, this is the work that I want to do. Will you fund it? Mm-hmm.
I wonder if Telos could start. I mean, I guess to some extent they do. If you're involved in the community, that you'll kind of hear rumblings of things that need fixing, and so it's just kind of there. It's almost like part of that bounty system can be integrated. I wonder if Telos is considered putting up an actual bounty board or something where they have a list of projects. You know if that exists right now?
I don't know, but there's no reason why both models couldn't exist in both ecosystems, really. Yeah. And they've both, probably got their pros and cons. I think in terms of like developing, core parts of the architecture, having that centralized has its benefits, and try to have lots of people like contribute to that makes things a bit messy. Whereas trying to incentivize the ecosystem to do things outside of that central part, might make more sense in some spaces. I think in the Ethereum ecosystem, they're really trying to, decentralize everything, and that includes all the work, and that's just part of their philosophy. So I think it makes more sense in their ecosystem than in EOSIO ecosystem. That said, they could both work.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, it's back to kind of your teaching and your YouTube videos. That teaching, I mean, you must have had to dig in really deep. I mean, to be able to teach something, especially to engineers, you're going to have to really have a deep understanding. You mentioned the consensus algorithm, and it's easy to explain on the surface, but there's some things that if you're building dApps that maybe you wouldn't see, or maybe most people wouldn't know. What's like a good example of something about Telos consensus algorithm that people might not know, but that dApp developers need to know or need to work with?
Yeah, so one thing that's really cool about Telos consensus is that most of the rules are on chain. So most of the rules in consensus are on chain. That means they're done through smart contracts. That includes the election of block producers. It includes the schedule of block producers, the voting of block producers. There's a few bits that are not on chain though, and that's creating the blocks and propagating around the network, and then getting everyone to agree that that is the next block. And what can happen is basically two block producers may make at around the same time a block that does extend from the previous block, and basically you have these two versions of the blockchain. That's called a mini fork. And at this point, what can happen is if that mini fork propagates for a little bit of time, a transaction may appear in one but not the other, and then be cancelled in the other one. It's like an extreme edge case that I really don't think developers need to know about, but it is something that could theoretically happen. And digging down to kind of find these details has been, a lot of work. I spent a lot of time on the EOS developers forum and the Telos developers forum, just hacking away with questions, and then like going to private conversations with loads of people. Block One assisted a little bit, not so much. They got to a few questions, but their support hasn't been so much in most of my endeavors so far.
What's the where's the best place that you're finding support within Telegram channels?
Yep, easily. Yep. Even today, I spent about an hour on the Boss Core developers channel, figuring out how their 3-second last reversible block algorithm worked, because they had a whole bunch of documentation, and getting the final answer was rough, but we got there all through Telegram.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, part of the reason that that you do a ton of things within the community, I've seen you bouncing around all kinds of Telegram channels, but I saw this article you wrote, the 8 worst issues and best features of EOSIO software, and and one of them was that this that has to do with Boss Core. It's a 3-minute block finality, right? Talk about why 3-minute block finality is a drawback, and how it sounds like Boss Core addressed that.
So, well, I'll just say I wrote this article. It focused on the EOS blockchain, which is a deployed network using the EOSIO framework, just like Telos is a deployed network using the same framework. And a lot of this article does apply to other deployed networks like Telos. Anyway, one of the characteristics of the EOSIO framework is how long it takes to achieve finality, and that means when you would consider a verse irreversible, when it would never be undone in the history of time. Now, the way it's done on built into the EOSIO framework means that takes about 3 minutes. If you have 21 block producers. And that's quite a long time. So you have a half a second for a block to be created. which is very fast. It's the fastest of all of the blockchain frameworks that I know, including, I will say, even a lot of the private permission enterprise blockchains, faster than those even. And that's an amazing usability feature because you send a transaction, it goes to the network, and then almost instantly your DApp can register that. It's a great user experience. But that only means that one block producer has really confirmed that transaction. It doesn't mean that the 15 out of the 21 required for consensus have actually confirmed it. That takes 3 minutes. And it's to do with the schedule of 21 producers. So you need to go through, each producer has a slot of 12 blocks to create. So you have to go through 15 blocks before 15 slots of 12 blocks before 15 producers have confirmed a block. And you have to do that twice. And the reason you have to do it twice is a bit complicated. It's actually, interestingly, due to some feedback that Vitalik Buterin gave to Dan Larimer during the design of delegated proof of stake. Anyway, so it's 3 minutes. And what that means is that to really believe and know that your transaction cannot be reversed means you've got to wait that 3 minutes. For most DApp usage, I don't think that's necessary. But for very high value transactions, say you're moving $1 million or something like this, or whatever transaction is you're betting $1 million on some betting app, you really want to wait to make sure it's been included in the blockchain and that cannot be reversed. So for those types of transactions, it's important. And so exchanges should, for high value transactions, or maybe most transactions, will wait at least that 3 minutes to see that it's achieved finality. And the issue is that is a very different experience to the half-second block time. So it's a usability problem.
So
at the end of the day.
how often does a block get accepted by one block producer, that half second, and then somewhere in that 3 minutes get reversed?
I don't think it's ever happened on EOS or Telos.
So that is so it theoretically can happen, doesn't happen often. So it sounds like that DApps, maybe that the trend that's using microtransactions or things like that can kind of operate on the half second.
I think if you waited, I think there are cases where you have these micro forks, and there seems to be about 1 or 2 every couple of minutes on EOS and Telos, as far as I've been viewing. So it does happen. So you can reverse blocks, but it usually happens that a transaction will still be included in the blockchain. Yeah, sorry, I should have made it clear. It is possible to have these forks. So in that case, you do kind of reverse a block, but very temporarily.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen after a minute. It happens within a couple of seconds usually, and then it resolves.
Okay.
And that does happen on I think EOS and Telos infrequently.
Okay. And that infrequently they'll kind of have an incorrect transaction and it'll revert back quickly before it gets past a minute or something, before it gets some sort of closer to finality.
Yeah, it happens when, for example, Telos San Francisco creates a block, and then what's one of the other block producers? Telos UK starts creating a block, but they haven't seen the block from San Francisco yet. So they start creating in their period, don't see this one, and they end up creating a longer blockchain before anybody else sees the one from San Francisco. So everyone just quickly switches here. This transaction was included in Telos UK's blocks, so it's not really a big issue. It pretty much always gets resolved very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So would you say the 3 minute block finality is it plays into it's most hindering within like big financial transactions or within I mean the most straightforward one would be gambling or exchanges.
Yeah, I think just your high value transactions you want to be quite sure about. That's when it's important. So I guess this issue is addressing the problem that for those you don't have this half-second usability feature that's promoted as how EOS and Telos work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense because it is like in just, you know, meetups and things like that. It's this big, I mean, we do demonstrations on our phones a lot and we'll have a meetup and then we'll say, look how fast this is. And I'll send, you know, $100 to Max and he'll show it on his phone and he'll send it right back to me. And everyone's like, oh, wow. You know, and it's like, when you're kind of promoting that transaction speed, but there is this 3-minute block finality that's kind of lingering in the background that we don't talk about so much.
Yeah, and you can see it on block explorers. So if you look it up on EOS Authority or wherever else, they'll show you its status,
Mm-hmm.
and it'll say like pending or waiting or something for those 3 minutes, and then it finally will say irreversible, and that's the 3-minute part.
Okay.
So it's on the blockchain. As far as I can tell, that's pretty trustworthy. Already. As soon as you can see it on one of the blocks, that means at least somebody, it's going to be there most likely, or at the very worst case, somebody else would pick it up on their next block on one of the micro forks. So it's usually not a problem. It's just a little detail in the story of how blockchains come to consensus.
And it sounds like Boss Chain was addressing this 3-minute finality a little bit and maybe shortened it. Does that seem like a really sound technical solution, or what kind of conclusion did you come to when you poked around for that?
Yeah, so I've been talking to those developers today and figuring out how that worked because I was interested. And what they've done is they've added an additional round of voting during the validation. So I create a block, it gets added to the blockchain, and then it gets sent out to everybody, and they all commit to each other. So within the top 21, that it is a valid block. So on Telos, the block gets added to the blockchain, and then that's it. Everyone else validates it, it's correct, and you've got this one block at the beginning. On Boss, the block producer creates their block, that gets sent around to all of the other blocks, and they send messages to each other and all of the rest of the network to show that all of the top 21 have accepted it. So this kind of happens off the chain, as far as I understand it. But because the messages of all the top 21 do get circulated around the rest of the network, it means that they all get a confirmation that at least 15 of the block producers have seen and accepted that block, even though it's only just been created. So that's how they get to this finality a lot quicker.
Okay. What kind of time, how much time are they saving doing that?
So I haven't done the calc for this, but they basically promoting that they have a 3-second last irreversible block. So 3-second finality, very fast.
That's substantial.
And there is an overhead with this. So there's an extra, there's more network traffic, and especially between the block producers themselves, they have to send more messages between them. So I think I saw on the docs that was adding like a 8 or 20% overhead to the network to do this.
So as far as
you're compromising kind of scalability a little bit and achieving faster finality.
Okay.
And I think it makes sense. Boss Core does seem to be focusing on the token itself as the major product of the network. So they're really focusing on the value transactions.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, it's cool to have all these chains, Telos, Boss, Warbly, all experimenting with different techniques, because hopefully they can all, if things like this start working, all the chains can be sharing ideas. It's interesting.
It is
For
cool.
sure.
Yeah. It's really, I think, so I worked on upgradability in the Ethereum ecosystem quite heavily. And I mean, I'll tell you, it's a real mess trying to upgrade smart contracts pretty much everywhere other than EOSIO. And I think one of the things that's got me very excited about EOSIO is being able to upgrade smart contracts. But that ability, being able to upgrade smart contracts and having the entire governance of the chain in smart contracts, meaning that you could upgrade the entire governance, is an astounding, a really exciting part of it. Not only is governance flexible, but it's super upgradable. And I think that means that the experimentation that can be done in the EOSIO ecosystem can be faster and more powerful than a lot of other places.
Yeah, that's something that stands out with Telos is the focus on governance, which seems to be right now one of the areas that EOS itself is struggling. So, the block producers essentially not contributing enough to the governance, and that's another thing that your article hit on. Can you kind of give your thoughts on that and why that's a current drawback that and how it's being addressed?
Yeah, sure. So it's an interesting topic. If you come, from before the EOSIO kind of came here, having a governed blockchain wasn't really talked about. What you wanted was the blockchain to be governed by an algorithm, and that's it. Or you had to trust with mathematics. And EOSIO and delegated proof of stake before that with Steem and BitShares introduced the concept of governance and having a reputation tied to the people that are producing blocks. And then especially with EOSIO, it introduced the concept of them contributing to the ecosystem through more than just their blocks, through more than just creating blocks. So the idea was them to build up reputation around the quality of the blocks they created, but also just what they did in the ecosystem. And also, the governance of the blockchain is really about upgrading the blockchain itself, upgrading those rules to adapt the technology to its issues and to the demand for new features. And that's something that we're seeing all over in the EOSIO chains, that this is being done. I think Telos is really leading this. It's got a lot of upgrades happening. It's exciting that you can see them. They're transparent. It's all on chain. And what's happening in EOS is that the vision of what a block producer should do and how it contributes to the ecosystem is shifting. And that's being shifted by who are the block producers themselves, because they, at the end of the day, decide what the rules are. And it's shifting to more of a return on investment for the voters and the block producers, kind of a business. So if you have EOS, a lot of block producers are now trying to incentivize you voting for them and earning a dividend or reward out of the block producer pay that they get for producing the blocks. And what that does is it moves away from having a governed blockchains where block producers are trying to add value to the ecosystem by, for example, producing blocks, by producing DApps and contributing to the ecosystem with research and other activities. And it's also, I think, makes the scope of upgrades a lot less, so that the block producers have this focus, have this lower scope of what voters should be voting for. So if voters are only voting for dividends, that means block producers are going to upgrade only if it optimizes their rewards and the rewards of voters and nothing else. Whereas on blockchains like Telos, the scope is wider. It can, I think, do more. And I think that's a more exciting blockchain for me, because it can try to upgrade and innovate in ways that EOS is now too limited to do.
Yeah, it does does make it seem more of a more nimble as far as the governance goes, and that's part of the reason that we've shifted a lot of our focus. We actually took down our EOS node at EOS San Francisco. Now we have our Telos San Francisco node that we're working on building right now. But that's our thought, is that that the focus has shifted. Is what are block producers adding, and what's the value proposition. So yeah, it's a shifting thing. I think a lot of the reason that people get into EOSIO is this idea that you talked about with me earlier, that that it's a bridge between blockchain, this pure technology, and human governance, and there's something there where human governance comes into play that is needed, or that's interesting, that needs to be really explored. Telos is starting to do a good job of that, I think. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on how much governance we need, how that fits in with blockchain just in general?
I mean, it's something I give a lot of thought to. So let me just take us back to Bitcoin and Ethereum and a lot of blockchains. The assumptions that a lot of these blockchain protocols make is that the block producers will be rational. And essentially what they're saying is they're assuming that block producers will be greedy, and that they will run software that optimizes their return. And that's Bitcoin, and basically it allows for a currency to be run with those assumptions, and it runs well in terms of the currency exists and can't be taken down. But it means that is a base foundation assumption for something that I think could be an instrumental part of society. So in society these days, we have humans. That's really at the core of all societies. Money has started to become a really a key mechanism within humans, and how we interact with each other, and how we trust each other and trade. Now, the question is, would you trust a society where one of the foundation assumptions is that everybody will be greedy? And I think that is the society that Bitcoin can create. And I think that is a future that I am not excited about, where one of the foundation assumptions for one of the key components of the society is that everybody will be greedy. And I think the scope of running a currency has to be, or the assumptions can't be that. Otherwise, we're writing our own demise in code. And for this reason, I think there's a lot to be said about the direction that blockchains are going towards. So first, we started with proof of work that assumed everyone's greedy, and basically says whoever has the most hardware and money to buy hardware can game the system. People are building on proof of stake, and now delegated proof of stake, where we start to introduce some more reputation into it, so some more human values into the system. And I think at the very end of the spectrum, one that we've seen is a democracy. So democracy is, in theory, trying to build a society, and it's got humans making all of the decisions. There's no algorithms at all. And I'm really interested in seeing us move towards something that values human values more than we see in algorithmic blockchains. And Telos, I think, is leading the way in terms of showing that blockchains can be governed and governed well. And I think is the leading platform that I would develop on if I wanted to build something that tried to bring human society values into a financial system, which I think is a foundation that I want to see the society that I live in to have.
Yeah, that's a that's a really layered concept there. That's very interesting. Yeah, the foundations that these societies are being built on, these right now they're small communities, but people, we can like extrapolate out and picture these turning into societies, or the network that societies operate on, in the same way that for thousands of years societies have built themselves around currencies and different ways of transacting. So there is a much bigger picture here, and it is, when you think about the foundation assumption being greed, that is a just on a psychological level, that is a kind of a scary thought. I wonder if I like the fact that Bitcoin can't be changed. I wonder if that can be siloed, and it seems like this is probably the direction it goes, is that Bitcoin can be siloed as this way to safely store money, but then actual societies can be built with more interactions, daily interactions with something governed, like the direction Telos is going. I mean, I hope that there's room for both. But there does seem to be this spectrum. I mean, on one end there's Bitcoin and this kind of code is law, and it's the foundation assumption is greed, and then the spectrum goes all the way to basically kind of a democracy or something there. But there's somewhere in the middle that we're trying to find where those two can live together. Mm-hmm.
I think for me, we have to go further than Telos is going to get something that I think is enjoyable to live in. So the way I see Bitcoin and other pure algorithmic cryptocurrencies, because they're permissionless and you can't change the rules, it means that they can only ever be, they can't run an entire society. They can only be a permissionless currency as part of society. But because they're permissionless, because it's anybody can do anything, it will require regulation to make it safe to use for normal people. And so I think what EOSIO framework can do is build a system where regulation and currency is actually built into the same system. That can never be done with Bitcoin. And that's a really exciting thing. I think that can create all of the friction losses and efficiencies that people talk about blockchain having in society, integrating these two parts together. But Bitcoin alone is a closed currency. It's not a closed society. It will always require external regulation to make it safe. Whereas, Telos and EOSIO allows you to potentially create it all built into one system. That's an exciting model that I haven't seen somebody really going down, and something that I'm putting a lot of thought into at the moment.
That's a great concept. I haven't heard that before, this argument against Bitcoin, because of the idea that for this, it's safe, or it's there and it's unchangeable, but the fact that it can never be safe for the masses unless it's regulated, well, then you're going to have governance on Bitcoin anyway. And
you're going to. It's already happening.
And so do you want this immutable Bitcoin with government regulation, or do you want to try to build it within the fabric of something new, some new way of governing? That is a fantastic thought. So you said that Telos hasn't maybe gone far enough, obviously, where everyone's experimenting right now. Where do you see some boundaries that Telos can continue to push, or that governance can be continued to push? Where is that frontier?
Build ways where regulation can be built onto the blockchain, and governance can be experimented with on the blockchain. So what I mean by governance to be experimented with, right now we see several deployed networks using the EOSIO framework. So you got the first one, EOS, Telos, which is the one that I'm most excited about. You got Boss Core, a few others. They're all experimenting with the rules, but they're all kind of separated from each other. What I think would be really interesting would be to create one deployed network that allows all of those experimentations to happen within it.
Mm-hmm.
And to make them all basically interoperable with each other, kind of competitive with each other, but within the same system. That would be a really interesting system, and it would allow governments to be experimented on, and then the kind of results of seeing how well that works across the board could be then incorporated into the kind of top level governance of the blockchain that's running this with inside it. It's kind of one idea I have, and yet the other was kind of starting to experiment with having human level regulation built onto the blockchain. There's a project on Ethereum. It's called like Open Law or OpenGL, something like this, and it's trying to basically build a regulation into a public Ethereum blockchain.
Wow.
And I think that's a really cool idea. I think that there needs to be, I'm not somebody who believes that the world can exist without laws. And that's the world that Bitcoin is really, thinks could work if it wanted to create a closed society. So I think humans can't really exist without some rules. And just think of your everyday life, whoever you live with or whatever it is, you're always setting up with rules or agreements, whatever. And so, the final result is that we have these legal frameworks, these regulation frameworks set up all over the world. And now we have the chance to make them super efficient through smart contracts and put them on the blockchain and work with finance in the same place and build the foundation up with both of them working together. I think that's something I'm looking at, and hopefully others. I know others looking at.
Yeah, I mean the reason we need rules. I mean, if you're living in a small community, 10 or 15 people, you can self-enforce rules, and there's social pressures. But if we want to live in a community with millions of people, there's not this. Your friend isn't putting social pressure on you because your friend lives 3,000 miles away and you only talk over a computer. Yeah, so I mean, there's a real clear need for rules because society has gotten so much bigger. The human level regulation on blockchain is one of the most interesting things that I see happen on Telos. That is part of the reason I'm part of the community. Is I like seeing this more hands-on approach. I mean, we are humans, and so when we see us building blockchains to cut us out of the equation, it's like that doesn't something there. There's a dissonance there for me where, wait, we're what this is all about. Why are we trying to get rid of ourselves in the decision-making process here? We have one of the greatest computers in the world that has creativity and ways to solve problems in our head, and we're trying to kind of sideline that. And so I like the idea, or I like the fact that Telos is more hands-on with governance, things like when block producers aren't producing, just kicking them off, giving them a cooldown period.
Very active there.
Yeah, very active there. If block producers are sock puppets, are not living up to a standard, they're actively kicked off. That opens the door for nefarious activity, obviously, but it also opens the door for an efficient blockchain. And I think that that's a really important part of it's the reason that that sports teams will have a captain, is because to operate the most efficiently, it's good to have someone helping push it along. And they're not always going to make the perfect decision, but they are making decisions, and then things happen accordingly. So yeah, I like that I do like that thought about human level regulation. Absolutely. And being part of the experiment, watching it all happen is fantastic.
Yeah, it's fantastic and stressful and
yeah.
and yeah, a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
It's very cool.
So the your article is interesting. I'm going to link it in the description for people, but it's your Medium article at the Block Stack. It's called "The 8 Worst Issues and Best Features of the EOS Blockchain." A lot of it has to do with Telos, and 2 or 3 of the things that were some of the big drawbacks on EOS, Telos is addressing. So I think that was kind of interesting for me. That's why I sought you out to come on the Telos podcast, is because of the fact that it's cool to see Telos addressing some of these things and experimenting.
Yeah. Well, by far the biggest issue is kind of the values of the current block producers on EOS and the direction it's going in. It's easily the biggest issue, and it's the most discussed within the EOS blockchain ecosystem. And I think Telos is really doing a good job there. And I think, as I explained in the article, if you have the right block producers, you can actually address all the other issues much easier. But if you don't have that right, you're stuffed. It's like having a corrupt government. Once it's corrupt, there's not much you can do.
Mm-hmm. And that's the idea, I think, that you hit on there, is the protocol upgrade centralization. Is that how you put it? That basically, if you get what we're seeing on EOS, is the incentives are now to optimize for block producers making money to give more rewards, and so all the that's going to slow down the protocol upgrades, because they're optimizing for a different thing. Yeah, that does become a downward spiral. So yeah, it's interesting to see how that's being addressed. It's great that Telos is addressing that. It's great that Boss is over there addressing some of the tech issues as far as making the money transferable. So
yeah, it's really good.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the other really big issues that is in this article is something that a developer recently did a very big investigation on. Yeah, Dexaran. He's recently, really highlighted how badly EOSIO frameworks handle congestion mode.
Mm.
So what basically happens is that blockchains have they have a limited amount of resources, and that limits the blockchain's ability to produce a certain number of transactions, whatever. Once the blockchain's nearly at capacity, the way EOSIO does is it kicks into something called congestion mode, and that then starts limiting people based on the wealth they have in the network. So the first people who basically just get completely cut off, they can no longer send transactions, are the poorest. That's bad in itself, but the other really bad thing, and this is something I didn't understand until his article, is that this congestion mode takes a long time to actually come out of. It can take up to like 20 minutes from it being initially congested to coming out of that time. And the third problem is that using the resource exchange, REX, you can actually buy enough tokens to congest the network with $10, $20. So you can basically stop the blockchain for indefinitely, very cheaply. And that's a big problem for all EOSIO chains. Nobody's yet to really solve this. I was very disappointed, again, to see that Block 1 denied that this is a problem.
Interesting. So because of the resource exchange, people are able to buy that amount of resources that cheaply. I didn't know that. Interesting.
Yeah. So this was part of the attack that that was made on EOS Bet on the EOS mainnet recently, and I think that's instigated this guy to really see what happened in this congestion mode. And the reality is, I could go rent out, 10,000 EOS for the price of about 10 EOS. Use those 10,000 EOS to completely spam the network for a long time. And I could do it almost indefinitely and stop DApps, token transfers. Only the extreme wealthy would then be able to use the blockchain. And that's a big problem. I think the issue was bigger than I originally understood it when I wrote the article, and I'm planning on updating the article to highlight that.
Yeah, that's the double-edged sword, because you want these resources cheap so that DApps can use it. But if the resources are so cheap that anyone can spam the network, then it starts to, I wonder how to solve that.
Yeah. Yep. So I think it comes down to this accounting model having some pretty fatal flaws. One of them is in the RAM price. I think there are some big issues there. And now the combination of congestion mode with the resource exchange has created this problem. One by itself is fine, but both together create this very easy to activate congestion mode, which is stuffs it up for everybody.
Is there a way, is there some sort of, do you think, human level regulation that can step in there and monitor that? Is that possible? Or
on EOS, no, because they removed all of their abilities to do kind of arbitration processes and stuff. I see no reason why, if somebody started doing that on Telos, the block producers couldn't stop it and then ban that account. Seems like it's a solution. Maybe it's not the best long-term solution, but it would be a way to effectively stop this happening on Telos. And block producers, the system contracts which block producers are allowed to use actually have unlimited resources. So block producers can always send transactions if they band together. So they would always be able to do this if they're active, which they are on Telos. So in fact, Telos has a way to stop this from happening. Whether it should be able to happen at all is probably another question that should be addressed. But I think less of a risk on Telos, that's for sure. And I would wonder, if somebody did this, what the block producers would do. And I'm not willing to spend $10 to do it, because block producers might ban me. Could be what they do.
Yeah, you get your account banned. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah. Well, that is that's one of the that is something that needs to be addressed. It's good there's a stopgap until there becomes some sort of engineering solution to that, though. That's good that they're absolutely good. There's a stopgap. That's one of the important parts about, like you're saying. I mean, that's why having active block producers is so important. Having active governance is so important, especially when you're so new in something. There's so many things that are going to break along the way, like this, and you need a stopgap to be addressed. I mean, you need that active governance to continue. So,
absolutely.
Is there anything else that you'd like to hit on as far as the as far as your article, as far as problems, solutions between on the EOSIO blockchain?
The RAM price model is also, I think, a major issue on most of the EOSIO blockchains. So what I've said in this article is that the price of RAM, so the price of storage that smart contracts can use, is determined by this one-sided algorithm. It's similar to how Bancor works. And the problem with this algorithm is that it doesn't know anything other than the supply and the demand of RAM. It doesn't know anything about how much capacity the network has. It doesn't know anything about the price of the token, which is, at the end of the day, a bridge to determine the cost that the block producers actually have in the real world. And that means it can't react to any of those variables automatically. And I think the place where this is most, I think, problematic is if you see the price change of Telos, the RAM price will change accordingly. If the price of Telos doubles tomorrow, RAM will all of a sudden cost twice as much, despite the fact that nobody's using more RAM and nobody's demanding more RAM. The cost will just have doubled straight away. And I think this model is unfair to block producers mostly, and unfair to DApp providers who then have, a lot of people want the Telos price to increase, but that will invariably mean that RAM gets incredibly expensive. This will also encourage, if the Telos price was to increase, it would encourage more nodes to enter the network. It would encourage more nodes to want to be block producers because there would be higher rewards. So it would encourage there actually be a higher cost of storing RAM. But it's the way that the cost of RAM in the algorithm synchronizes with the real cost within the network is very much not succinct. It's not very quick to react on that. So if you doubled the price, the time it took for the actual amount of costs in the network to double would, not be instant. And that's something that I think could be addressed by having the block producers actually participate in setting the price to some level. I think that would be a good idea.
As far as setting,
or a good idea to try at least. Mm-hmm. So allowing the block producers to say, okay, look, so something that they do in Ethereum is they adjust the gas price, and that could be done in a similar way. Every block producer is allowed to propose a slight change on the RAM price. Is how it's done in Ethereum. So I think in Ethereum they're allowed to change it by 0.006% every new block. Similar thing could be done in EOS, where the block producers can actually influence the price. It can still react somewhat automatically based on the supply and demand, but then block producers can also adjust it based on the price within the network that it costs them and it costs the rest of the network to store that data in RAM. And I think that would be a more predictable way for block producers and DApps to understand their costs. And that would be better for everybody.
And would that be something that the block producers would do on they would have their adjustment in, how often would they be submitting that, would you think?
I'm not sure. It depends. You could say that every block producer is allowed to propose per block or per minute or something, a change. And then essentially what would happen is at some point some events happen and all of a sudden RAM demand goes up. The bank or other can increase the price, which is good, but all of a sudden the block producer, okay, it's actually not that expensive still. We can put it down a little bit. So I'm going to start on my blocks decreasing it by a little bit. And supposedly some other block producers don't agree with that. They can increase it. And eventually it all comes to consensus, I think still.
Yeah, maybe block producers could have some sort of like a rate limiter almost, like as it increases through a certain price, then they start voting for it to go down a little bit. Maybe they could automate that.
Yeah, there could be a few more variables, and I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of interesting approaches that could be taken here. The one I'm talking about is the one that they do in Ethereum, and basically the block producers can directly, they can't set the price, but they can change the price by a tiny amount per block. So that's one thing you could do here. The other is you could give the block producers access to some variables, and that influences the price as well as the supply and demand. that might be a more transparent solution, and that's something the block producers can kind of agree on in a bit of a better way. Different approaches. I'm not sure which would be best, but nobody's really looking at this problem yet. I think there are bigger problems. There's definitely bigger problems in EOS, and I think a bigger problem is the congestion mode still. But I think RAM price is a problem. I've heard several DApp producers complaining about this as well. So I think it's a problem that should be addressed.
Is that forcing DApp people running DApps to hold more RAM just in case? I mean, is they having to hold more in reserve all the time for that, or how's that affecting them?
It's a good question, and I wouldn't feel qualified to really answer that on behalf of anybody.
All right, yeah.
I can't. If I had better memory, I might be able to remember the conversation details, but I can't exactly say what they've said. Yeah, that seems like a reasonable assumption to me.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm not exactly sure.
Some of the other things that you mentioned, it seems like we've hit on a lot of things that you mentioned in your article. You mentioned the smart contract upgrade centralization. Can you explain that a little bit?
So one of the really cool parts about the EOSIO framework is that most of the rules are on-chain. They're in smart contracts, and the permissions to upgrade those rules reside with the block producers. So the way it now is on EOS is that as soon as 15 block producers agree on an upgrade, then they can upgrade the rules to whatever they want it to be. There's really no other process other than that. My understanding in Telos is that it needs to go through some kind of referendum process first, where you get input from the users, and then it can be upgraded. So it's better on Telos, but on EOS, it really comes down to the block producers only. And this is different to the rest of the consensus. Block consensus on EOS and Telos is the top 21 producers have to agree, but then also all of the validating nodes have to agree. If both the things don't happen, blocks will not synchronize across the network. They may synchronize within the top 21, but they won't get out of the network if you're disagreeing with the rules of the block. So it's more decentralized than just 21 nodes. It's decentralized to hundreds of nodes. That's the decentralized level of Telos and EOS. But the decentralized level of upgrading the rules is now only with 15 nodes. So that's the most central point of the system. And upgrading the rules is, as you can imagine, extremely important. It's an important security consideration. If you can upgrade the rules, and remember that the rules include the system token, the Telos token is part of the rules. The block producers can upgrade the rules and say, you can now double spend this token. 6 people can own a token at once, all kinds of crazy things. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm saying it's theoretically possible to just completely change the rules of the token. And so it becomes a pretty fundamental part when you're talking about security of the chain. One thing that is to the benefit of all EOSI frameworks is that all upgrades are also done through an on-chain transaction. So everything's super transparent. You can't upgrade it without anybody knowing. But it still is the most central point of EOSIO networks, is the upgrade process. And on EOS, after they passed the end user agreement, the EUA, after they passed that took away the referendum process and meant that the power to upgrade existed solely within the block producers, the 21 block producers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a funny concept how even with governments and just with humans in general, the group in power has this tendency to continually take little micro steps of gaining more power over time. And it's kind of a one-way street. And it's interesting to see that happen even with this decentralized blockchain like EOS with this grand vision. It's like one of the first steps that was taken was, should just have a little bit more, we need to kind of centralize this a little more. We need a little bit more power as the block producers here. Yeah, it's just it's almost like part of human nature that people in power want to consolidate that power or solidify it a little bit. Over time, it has an effect.
And I think that's something that's somewhat intoxifying in this whole blockchain industry. And I think it's something that needs to be refreshed. And that's why I talk about the size, and I think human values need to be brought into blockchains more than they are now. Otherwise, we will end up with systems that are governed by the richest, which, in my opinion, is one of the whole things, one of the reasons why we didn't want blockchains. We didn't want banks running the system anymore. And if we want something that's better than that, I think we have to try to actively build it. And the way I see a lot of cryptocurrencies being developed is that it's basically heading straight for that. Delegated proof of stake may in the future really look like proof of stake. And that will be very interesting if it does.
What do you mean by that? How delegated proof of stake might look like proof of stake as far as the rich governing?
Yeah, so, in EOS, what we're seeing is that the whales and the exchanges are holding all of the voting power. And the reason they're voting for the ones they're voting for is because they're getting rewards back from the block producers themselves. They're paying them, some voting rewards. And that's very similar to how proof of stake works. So what we're seeing on EOS is that basically, wealthy exchanges and whales are voting for block producers and then getting paid for that in taking part of that cut. And that's starting to look very similar to proof of stake pools, where you bundle your wealth together with others, you put it with somebody who can create blocks, they run a bit of software to create the blocks based on the amount of wealth you have, and then it's starting to look very similar. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's almost the delegated proof of stake. It's just adding the layer of delegation, but once that delegation is incentivized by rewards, then all of a sudden it's just a facade for straight proof of stake almost. So
yes, yeah, it looks more and more like it. Exactly.
Yeah, would you like to talk about the unused inflation model?
Yeah, it's a really good one. I think it opens up the possibility of what a blockchain can do, far more than previous. So 5% inflation rate is pretty high. That's a lot of tokens, especially on EOS, where tokens are worth a lot. And on Telos, they're being put to good use. But what it means is instead of having a closed currency system, all it does is run itself. All it does is create blocks and allow dApps to build on top of it. Is it can actually create its own ecosystem that it itself contributes to. And that's, I think, a really important sustainability model and consideration. So a lot of blockchains in the past, have foundations that are set up on the side that are dedicated to building the blockchain software. Whereas with an inflationary model like you have on these frameworks in EOSIO, it should be quite possible for that all to be combined, so that the inflationary model is used to pay for the development of the software, and also not just the software of the blockchain, but also parts of the software and the ecosystem. So the free parts that people want to depend on. So that might be wallets or whatever it is. And I think that's a really exciting part
of this inflationary model is that it can create a more closed system, create a more circular system. And I think that's a sustainability characteristic that I think allows that to be really more interesting than what we've previously seen in public blockchains. I think the first one to introduce this was Dash. They did a treasury system, and it was extremely successful. So I think this is an extension. They've done some really cool stuff in like Venezuela with their treasury system, and I think people should get, using those funds to do things like build wallets and stuff in the ecosystem. But making a blockchain more than just a financial system could involve using some of those funds to build a bridge in a war zone where it got destroyed. Thinking outside the box, let's build a society on a blockchain. That's what that inflationary model allows us to do potentially. And it really increases the scope of what a blockchain can do.
Yeah, it's another one of these really beautiful segues into human governance and blockchain, whereas in the States we'll pay taxes, and a lot of people feel like a lot of their taxes are wasted on things that they're not interested in or didn't want to happen, but and then there's not much accountability for how the money is spent. More importantly, like it seems like it can be wasted. With blockchain governance, and we were talking about building a bridge as an example, there would be some sort of clear deliverable that people that the community is able to vote on, and then have a budget for it and a and a clear deliverable. And that's something that is sorely needed within kind of the governance models that we've been operating with for a long time. So that is kind of a bright future for, as we think about blockchain expanding into our lives and how humans actually govern each other. But accountability for where the inflation in this case, or some sort of inflation could almost be looked at like a tax, where that's going, how that's being spent for public resources, essentially.
Yeah, it opens up the ability, if you did view a blockchain as a closed society ecosystem, then that inflation is the tax on people's savings. But it means you don't have to have any other tax if that becomes too enough. So it means that all of the accounting and shit that we do for taxes, and all of the legislation around tracking and trying to find taxes, isn't needed anymore. And that's a huge friction reduction in itself.
No problem. And the option to opt in and out of these systems is something that you don't see with current taxes. You're kind of stuck. You're born somewhere, and that's the system that you're a part of. With different blockchains and these closed systems, but you're opt in, opt out. That is a huge model. All of a sudden, if you feel like you're part of this system and they're spending their inflation the incorrect way, well, there's options for mobility within different systems. Where do you want your money to be spent? How do you want it to be spent? What part of community, what kind of society do you want to be a part of? So that flexibility is huge, I think, because people are so different.
I think when you start talking about societies on a blockchain, a lot of people in this space, decentralization is a big buzzword. And I think there's a lot of good characteristics of decentralization, but there's a lot of good characteristics of blockchain that have nothing to do with the decentralization. Just having the cryptographically transparent operations and the cryptographic accountability is super important. And I think something that EOSIO shows extremely well is that when you're voting on the funds, actively voting on the funds and seeing where they're being used, not only is it more transparent, you can see what's happening there, you're feeling involved. You feel like you've made part of the decision of where it got used. So even if it was done badly here, you feel accountable yourself. So I think that's also a kind of circular part in the society and these systems that can mean that even though we might have a government on a blockchain, it can be much better than today because people can be much more involved with it and it can be more transparent.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the feeling that, the feeling of involvement is important. Absolutely. That's part of the reason that that incentivizes people to be a more active part of their communities. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, when I work within my teams and groups that I work with, the team members that participating, they're the ones that are kind of happiest, and the ones that are being the least transparent about what they're doing, they're the ones that people have the most problems with. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the same case that we have in societies these days. I'm not trying to black box this and say everything's about this, because life is definitely not black and white. But I would say this is a part of the value that, I guess part of the vision that I see for blockchains is that it can be more than just a cryptocurrency. And I think Telos is showing a lot of interesting steps into it potentially doing that, and EOSIO frameworks really allow for in ways that couldn't be done before. Really cool stuff.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a great talk. Really interesting things here. Didn't disappoint after reading your article. I was excited to talk to you about all this. This has been fantastic. Did you have anything that you'd like to hit on? Any last points you'd like to cover before we start to wind down here?
I don't think so. I mean, we have certainly spoken through all of the pretty bad parts about the EOS network, but I'm not somebody, and a lot of those points apply to Telos and other blockchains. But you should read this article that I wrote. I do think EOSIO is the leading framework for blockchains, and I've outlined why it's more usable, it's more transparent, it's more upgradable. I'm still very much looking at a bunch of other platforms myself. I'm pretty chain agnostic, and I'm pretty critical on blockchains. But don't feel like if you're listening to this, that just because we're shitting on a few of these issues that these frameworks don't work, or they don't work better than what's previously been done anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the other half of this article is the 8 best things about EOSIO software. So go read the article. I think that people most people are really familiar with the good things. That's why I've been doing EOS for the last couple of years. There's a lot of good going on. So that definitely shouldn't be overshadowed. This has been fantastic. Thank you, Jack. And if you're listening to this and you want more from Jack Tanner, he is at the Blockstock on Twitter. And you got a really interesting Twitter. I went through your Twitter. You share some cool articles. One of the articles that you shared was actually some of the governance things that we talked about in society and building societies on blockchains. And you got stuff about all different blockchains on there, which was cool. Stuff about Tether and so cool follow for Twitter. And I'll link the Medium article here. Have some cool Medium articles you've written. Where would you like people to find you on socials, Jack?
I think just Twitter. Don't go on my LinkedIn. I've got too many requests. You can follow my Medium. I do write there occasionally. I do like writing there. I think I'm interested to see if I'm going to join Voice. It depends on how much of my personal information they want to put on a blockchain. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any insight? If they ask for my address to go on the blockchain, I'm not going to join Voice, so you won't see me there.
Yeah. You say if they ask for your address?
If they want me to publish my address on the blockchain, I don't think I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
It depends how they do this. It's been asked for me on a few DApps already. So on EOS DAC, I went to join, and you had to put your full name and full address on the blockchain. I said, no, I'm not part of that.
No kidding.
I think it's a privacy issue for me at the moment. I'm happy to put my name on the blockchain. I think that makes sense. I'm happy to put my name on my reputation, but other things aren't necessary at this stage. So I'm interested to see. I have a feeling I've seen a few hints that they may be doing stuff like that. I'm interested to see how that gets handled by them. But
Yeah.
if then I should be in voice, and I'll be excited to test that out as well.
Yeah, I hope they find some sort of balance where it's not a privacy issue, because if so, that's going to be that'll be a sad day. It's weird to I mean, it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because they're in DC working so close with the U.S. government, with the regulators, where they paid the SEC recently, which seems like a good sign. But also on the flip side of that, it's like they are deeply in bed with the government now, and I wonder what sort of concessions they'll have to make to launch voice. It's going to be what interesting times. I wouldn't rather be at any other time than right now. This is crazy, really interesting.
Lachlan's are really kind of a piece in this whole ecosystem for me.
Mm-hmm.
They've produced something, very good, but the way they interact with the people in the ecosystem is different to, well, certainly what I'm used to with other blockchain ecosystems. And they're certainly doing things differently.
Yeah. Do you have any predictions or any insight on voice? When do you think that'll launch, or what's the timeline you think on that? Your guess?
I haven't followed enough. Wouldn't make a prediction.
Too bad. Me neither, though. I have no idea. I always ask people. I'm always hoping someone's been talking to Dan in Telegram and he let something slip. Cool.
Dan. Yeah.
Well, fantastic to have you on, Jack. It was fantastic to meet you.
Thanks very much, man.
Yep, absolutely. And my Telos podcast friends, until next time, cheers.
Yep. Thanks, guys. Bye.
The money is not the prime asset in life. Time is.